Hey, welcome everybody. It is 7 o'clock in the East. It is 4 o'clock in the West. I am Galen, and welcome to the strategy session. Joining me this evening, as always, the host of the Enemies List podcast and best-selling books, Everything Trump Touches Dies and Running with the Devil, Rick Wilson. Rick, welcome.
Hey, Reed.
And longtime Republican adman and author of It Was All a Lie, in addition to many other books, Stuart Stevens. Stuart, welcome back.
It's good to be here. I'm glad Rick's wearing pink.
Right.
Hey,
You
it's the
know,
Well, it
season
is
now,
it
guys.
is May,
it, it
right? It's going to
it's
be
a very
nothing but pink and
southern
seersucker till
thing
Labor
to
Day.
do.
Listen, I'm going
Right.
on a trip in a couple weeks. I got a lot of linen planned for it. So,
Oh,
Good,
well,
good.
good. We'll do a Resolute Square fashion show just
With
with
your
you
go
guys
to
before
hell
we get out of here.
pants. Yes.
That's right.
yes, I will
Um,
wear my go to hells.
well, guys, it's been quite a busy day in American politics. Tucker Carlson said he'll be back on Twitter. George Santos, we think, has been charged, but we don't know if that means indicted with something by the Department of Justice. Trump was found guilty of sexual assault against E. Jean Carroll. The debt ceiling looms. Trump and Biden are, the front runners for 2024, and people are flipping out because of a poll 18 months before Election Day. The right wing
A
MAGA
poll of
ecosystem.
registered voters, not even likelies.
Well, you can explain that to the folks here in a second. So, dealer's choice, Rick. Where do you want to start?
Listen, I got to say, we start with the fun stuff. George Santos, tomorrow he was about to reveal both his cure for cancer and that he had developed ChatGPT into a fully fledged artificial intelligence. But instead, apparently, the DOJ is going to be arresting him. We don't know the particulars yet. The story just broke a little while ago. It is a sealed indictment of some kind, but DOJ is coming down on this guy. And Charlie Sykes, our friend Charlie Sykes from the Bulwark, just had a great tweet. He found a tweet that George Santos had put out about the GOP being the party of law and order, and he was going to see criminals going to jail.
Well, Stuart, I would say this is that if the quickest way for your poll numbers to go up in the Republican Party now is to be indicted for something.
I know. It's really, Rick and I, we go back into business. We can make attack ads, never indicted.
Right,
Right.
right.
Um,
And I think
it,
He says he's a strong
we've all
Republican
at
leader,
least
but
all
he's
had
never been
clients
indicted.
indicted. We've all had clients indicted and or convicted,
Oh
not for
yeah.
things we've done, thankfully, right? But so this is not an unusual situation. But Santos is Stuart such an inveterate pathological liar. Maybe I'm being duplicative
yeah,
there.
and look,
It's
let's don't overlook that the leading former president of the United States and a leading front runner and the guy who runs the Republican Party was just found guilty of sexual assault by a jury of his peers. What I love about this is they say, well, that was a New York jury. It's like, guys, the guy's from New York. It's his
Right.
yeah,
hometown jury. I mean,
desperately wants to be a Manhattanite.
yeah, I mean, most people would have,
Desperately.
the prosecutors wanted to change a venue to get out of his hometown. Um, so, I mean, I think I can't begin to gauge the political impact. Probably it'll mean nothing to Republican voters. But I think it's an important moment. I know Eugene Carroll a little bit because we used to write some
Yep.
of the same
Same here.
magazines. Um, and, if I'm going to trust and believe Eugene Carroll and Donald Trump, there's no question. But I think that, this begins to, you can draw a straight line to this, to Donald Trump bragging about assaulting women and still getting endorsed by the
Right.
Republican Party. Now he's been convicted of it. Um, so I think it's an important statement. And I think the odds are really, really good that Joe Biden is not going to be convicted of sexual assault before the next candidate. So we're going to have a stark difference between the two.
Well,
You
I
know,
think that's right. And Rick, that's the thing is that now the two legal issues so far this year that Trump has been contending with. His indictment was related to hush money paid to Stormy Daniels, a porn
right.
star with whom he was having an affair. I don't remember if it was while Melania was pregnant or right after the baby
Just
was
after she
born,
was pregnant.
just after she was pregnant, and then this obviously. So this is something to Stewart's point. This is something that he's bragged about for decades, right? That this is, as he says in that infamous tape, you can do whatever when you're famous, you can do whatever you want with them. But now, at least half the electorate, or maybe a little less, seems to be okay with that, and I assume Rick too. that evangelicals will find some passage in the Bible that says that all of this is okay.
Of course, of course. Well, look, and I was on Sky News this afternoon, and they seemed in the UK, and they still seemed shocked. They're like, "Well, how could evangelicals still support him after this?" And I said, "Look, they knew who he was in 2016. They heard all this before. They know exactly what this guy is. It's all priced into their equation that Donald Trump is the avatar of God's will on earth. It is a cult-like devotion, and so nothing he does will shake the faith of those hardcore MAGA voters, that 35% of MAGA voters who are going nowhere. And look, I think it's important, and LP tweeted this out this afternoon. It's a really important point. E. Jean Carroll was one of the few people who, after all this time has passed, was still not going to let this guy off the hook, who was
Mhm.
not going to let him walk away from his horrifying, sick behavior, who was not going to say, it's just who he is, so what? And even though I think that the jury fell short, both in the conclusions and in the award they sought to give her for Trump's behavior, I think it's important to look at her as somebody who really stood up. And it is not easy and for victims of sexual assault to come forward and to persist in the face, especially when it's Trump, of the harassment and the abuse and the legal terrorism and everything else. And so I think we really ought to recognize just how brave she was to do this in the face of the fact that this case was a long time ago. It was a hard case to make, and it was a case where she knew every day she has to get up and get the death threats and the abuse from these people, and that it probably won't alter the views of the Republican voters who adore and worship Trump.
Well, and Stuart, it doesn't appear to be changing the opinion of the Republicans who I think consider themselves better than Trump, or at least different than Trump.
Please,
They're all blaming the New York jury. They're all, blaming corrupt, judicial system, whatever the case might be. Um, you know, Kevin McCarthy saying he hasn't seen the news. Rick Scott saying he hasn't seen the tweets. So this is really nothing changes, right, with
yeah,
with the reaction to this stuff, which is none of them want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because ultimately they're all afraid of
Yeah, I mean, look, it all goes back to that thing we used to say a lot in the Republican Party, and some of us actually believe that character counts and that character is destiny. I think Peggy Noonan wrote a book called something to that
hmm
effect. Character was king, I think. And it turns out that's right. And what the Republican Party did was make a deal for power. That if you give us power, then we will not only let all these values that we said were bedrock values slip away, we'll be against them. We'll actively campaign against them. So now we're the character doesn't count party. We're not, we're the personal responsibility. We used to say that a lot, the party of personal responsibility. Now, take personal responsibility, you're a sucker. You're a
right,
fool. Um, my position on this has been that that just proves that those weren't deeply held beliefs because no one
right.
abandons deeply held beliefs in a couple of years. They were just marketing slogans.
So
And
Rick, this is one thing I want to ask about because we're now almost 8 years into the Trump era, and I'm sure we've all had friends who work in Republican politics, or
Oh yeah,
and in 20, let's say 2017, right, or 2019, they said, "Look, I got a business. I got 22 employees. I got bills to pay. I got to do this other stuff. What else? I live in Washington D.C. I work within the party. There were all the level of rationalizations, but they're still saying the same thing now, right? It's like,
yeah,
oh well, I work for Republican candidates in the House. It's not the same thing. I work for Republican governors. It's not the same thing. I work for Republican senators. It's not the same thing, but it
sure.
is because they made a deal with the devil and now they're stuck with it.
It is a continuum now of they have to defend Donald Trump. Kevin McCarthy knows he loses his job tomorrow if he goes out and says I'm disgusted by the fact that a jury today found Donald Trump sexually assaulted E. Jean Carroll. That's a pure statement of fact. It's a relevant statement of fact, but it will cost Kevin his job. They know it. The Republican Party is governed by fear and terror inside because it's an authoritarian movement now. It's not a party. It's the apparatus of an authoritarian leader named Donald Trump. And so you will not see anybody make the two-part statement. Some Republicans, like Susan Collins, will go and go, I'm disappointed to learn this. But they will not say, and I will not vote for Donald Trump. And I will not cast a vote for Donald Trump. I will not support him for president. I will vote for Joe Biden, who is not at best rape adjacent, who is not a sexual assaulter. And the people who think that 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 Donald Trump is morally fit to be president and also want to pretend that they're not like him and continue to support him. I mean, this is where the party is. It is completely bereft of a moral compass of any kind.
So last week, Stuart, just to stay on this thread of fear, because this it really is, I think, the driving
Yeah.
force within the GOP. Senator Steve Daines from the state of Montana, he's the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the committee that tries to elect and re-elect Republican senators. He endorsed Trump last week and said he's going to be the nominee anyway. We might as well get on board early. Mitch McConnell said this week that he's for all Republicans, right? And which is not surprising because he's now back to where he needs one more turn around the bend, in the majority leader's chair if he can get it. But here's the thing that I find this behavior very like 1933 or 1938-esque, I guess, or 1939-esque, which is,
Sticks.
we've got
Yeah.
we've got to do what we've got to do here, and if we just give him what we want, he'll leave us alone. So, it wouldn't surprise me, Stuart, if some of our friends in Washington D.C. had a conversation with Chris LaCivita, Trump's top guy, right, Mr. Swiftboat, and said, "Look, we're going to come to you early, but you got to make us a deal that he'll leave our nominees alone. He won't get involved in this." And LaCivita's like, "Yeah, sure. I talked to the boss. He said fine, but here's the difference: is that Trump doesn't care. He's going to do whatever he wants, whether these guys like it or not. And if he believes it can hurt Mitch McConnell, he'll do it. But they
Yeah,
don't seem to get it."
Reed, I was working on something and I came across a quote from McConnell in 2016 before the election when he was asked, isn't Donald Trump basically a lunatic and a crazy person and against everything you believe in? And here's the quote he said then: I think we're much more likely to change him because if he is president, he's going to have to deal with sort of the right of center world, which is where most of us are. So, how'd that work out? Um,
Right.
McConnell, I bet probably McConnell would say I was right. I got my Supreme Court justices, which, I lied about, and they lied when they were confirmed.
He got his judges and his tax cuts. That's all he ever cared about.
It's
Yeah,
all he ever
and
wanted. It's all he ever wanted.
I think, yeah, the country is basically the sort of civil society, the pillars are under attack, which is really when they're attacking the judicial system, which is at the heart of a rule of law. How do you have rule of law without a judicial system?
But Stuart,
And
if you look at the Harlan Crow stuff vis-a-vis Supreme Court
yeah,
Justice Clarence Thomas and all of the trips and gifts, homes and educations that this guy paid for, and now you look at the right, and we're talking even the quote unquote conservative intelligentsia or what pays for it. This is now a liberal attack on the judicial establishment
yeah, I mean, you have the Supreme Court justice who is, in a position that normally like an oligarch's mistress is in. Um,
with a
a,
wife who's a would-be seditionist.
a stone crazy person, a crazy person. And right now, the Supreme Court is at its lowest level of public approval in the history of polling. And there's no coincidence about that. They have this attitude that if you can do it, power gives you the right to do it, not the reason to do it.
Right.
So, I would come around if I was a Democrat. I would say add Supreme Court justices. Go right at it. Go ahead, call them out. If that's the game we're going to play that game. Because it really is an unequal balance when we have one side that is willing to do anything and the other that still is playing by some rules which no longer really adhere. You're
Right.
back to, when there was a resistance in England in World War I to having a spy service, and they said the gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail.
Right.
Um, I, if that's the world we're in, Democrats should act like that's the fight.
Yeah. Well, and Rick, that's, Trigby Olson, who's a
Hmm.
friend of ours and contributor, always says you got to fight, you got to play the game you're in, not the one you're
Play the
used to.
game you're in, not the one you want to be in.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, to Stewart's point, I mean, Harlan Crow today said to the Senate, go fuck yourself. I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to tell you what I've given him. I'm not going to discuss it. I'm not going to give you any information. And look, these there is a growing sense of the insulation of power among these people that that is
Mhm.
it's transcended arrogance now, and it's gone into this sort of overt hostility to the rest of our democracy because they know he's not going to be held to account. They know that the Democrats don't have the guts to push for something to make Harlan Crow come forth and testify because the Republicans will scream and fight it and they worry about civility and comity in their caucus and they don't or in the body, and they don't understand these people aren't fucking around. They see their goal line in sight. They don't want more elections. They just
Well,
want
and to
power.
Stewart's point, right? To Stewart's point, many of these people came within 30 seconds and the bravery of, Officer Eugene Goodman from being strung
Yes.
up, right? And yet, whether or not it's that experience, Stewart, generally or January 6th specifically, that, we have, it's like we have the collective, memory of a goldfish at this point. And I think that with the Republicans, it's by desire, and for so many of the rest of us, it's just like I don't want to think about it. Everything's going to hell in a handbasket when data would indicate otherwise, but that's how everybody seems to feel apparently. But again, these you mix the Republican Party with the MAGA movement led by Trump, and now
Yep.
you have these people who do conduct violence on behalf of this movement. They will again, and
Yeah.
nobody. It's like, what do we need to do to get people to wake up?
Yeah, and I think we ought to realize that this is the culmination, Rick talks about this a lot, of uh, decades of work.
Yep.
And they think they're going to win. I mean, we don't talk enough about Leonard Leo getting $1.6 billion. Leonard Leo, who ran the Federalist Society. And you can draw a line from what has happened to the Supreme Court, where for the first time, there's only been 5 Supreme Court justices in the history of America who were confirmed by senators who didn't represent a majority of the voters. And all 5 are on the court right now. And 3 of them were appointed by a president who didn't win the popular vote. So there's sort of a minority of a minority. So you've got Leonard Leo out there who was given $1.6 billion. And one of the things they're going after aggressively is trying to pass laws in state legislatures so that state legislatures can overturn the popular vote. So that's really what their goal is. It's not to pull off a coup next time. It's to make a coup unnecessary. So if Georgia
And
passes a law that says that you can overturn the popular vote, when Georgia does it, what do you say?
But
It's legal.
but Rick, the codicil, right, or the parallel track to that is the kind of stuff that we've seen in El Paso, Allen,
sure.
Texas this week, Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life, Buffalo at the African American supermarket, which is, what they call stochastic violence, which is it's all violence driven by the idea and demonization of a specific group
Right.
or groups. What makes it difficult to track is that it is random in its timing, but not random in its occurrence, if that makes sense. And I know that's a weird distinction,
No,
but
it's
that's the
true.
kind
It's
of thing we're
true.
seeing.
I mean, look, the guy that shot up, that was the attacker in Allen, Texas this weekend. The American MAGA movement, when they found out he was Hispanic, they went absolutely out of their minds. Like, that can't be white supremacist or terrorist violence on the right. But it turns out he's got a Russian social media page. He's American, but Russia doesn't censor things like Nazi propaganda. It turns out he posts on 4chan right before the attack. He wants to get a high score. They've gamified this. They've taken a generation of young men and they've whittled down their moral conscience so far, and they've convinced them that every problem in their life has to do with an African American or an immigrant or someone who's different than they are. That every problem in their broken families, their broken histories, their broken lives is only solvable now by going out and becoming a part of a movement that is going to put bodies on the floor in order to try to start a race war in this country. And from Tucker Carlson at the pinnacle of that bullshit when he was on Fox doing his white replacement theory thing, all the way down to the scumbags who run the Chans 4 and 8 and all the rest of the bullshit and all the Discord server channels where they're telling these guys, yeah, the only hope for you is to start the race war, is to go out and kill people. It is most horrific because of one rule, and it's Steve Bannon's rule that informs the entire Republican and MAGA movement now. And that rule is no enemies to my right. So they can't even condemn these fucking murderers or their thoughts and prayers in. They can't even condemn the machine that creates these people. And I know everyone's first inclination is go for the guns. It's the guns that are a problem. These people are evil. One of these fucking guys ran people over with his car. These people are being created, and the social media companies here and around the world have a giant responsibility for it because they know who they know who they're going to be, they know who they are, they know how these tools are being used to radicalize them. But the MAGA movement deeply, deeply, deeply doesn't want to be called Nazis or white supremacists or promoters of violence against minorities. But that's where they are, and
So, Stuart,
a lot of them are trying to look away from the reality of what they've created.
So, Stuart, in one of our conversations earlier today, you found a piece of data about the impact of race. I believe it was in the state of Iowa.
Yeah, it's a very interesting study. I'd never seen it before. That Iowa State, three sociologists from Iowa State. Iowa had more counties than any other state that flipped from Obama to Trump. And so they did a study of these 31 counties to try to determine why it was that they switched. And they went into it, if you read their study, believing that it was going to be factors of economic pressure.
Right.
As it turns out, that really didn't have anything to do with it. That they were actually better off for the majority of them than they were earlier. It was all about fear. And one of the more fascinating aspects of it, the degree of anti-immigrant fervor among these voters was in direct proportion to how little they knew any immigrants. So when you looked at the part of Iowa where there are immigrants, and there are immigrants in Iowa,
Yeah, they work the slaughterhouses because
they
nobody
work
else
in
will.
slaughterhouses, they're
Right.
arguing. Where in those places, people were fine with immigrants because they knew them. And that reinforces what lots of studies show. So, I don't understand. There's this weird need among the media that has really spawned this genre of reportage of, Trump men in a diner. Like, why is it that we can't just call them racist? It's extraordinary. And I think it's dangerous because it is racist. The only economic group in the 2020 election that Donald Trump carried were those who make $100,000 or more. That's not
Well,
economic.
and Stuart, that also goes to what Bart Gellman talked about in his piece about January 6th now over a
Yep.
year ago, and a guy named Bob Papa, an academic, I believe at the University of Chicago, that most of the people who are now likely to be radicalized in this country, and they studied the types of people, based on who they could figure out, were at the Capitol on January 6th, white, middle-aged, successful. right?
Yeah.
And what the prime indicator to your point was, these were people who lived in congressional districts that had started out majority Anglo and had become more multicultural or
Right,
multiracial over the years. So to your
right.
point, it wasn't like some of these people took private jets, right? Some of these people had thousands of dollars worth of battle rattle on as they worked in their stacks or sticks or whatever you call it as they went up the. So that's the other part too. Is yes, the guys that Rick are talking about, they are the foot soldiers in this. I don't even know what the right word is. The slow civil war, as Jeff Charlotte would call it, right? But the people who make up the electorate, the people who vote, the people who give the money, the people who show up, are not economically disadvantaged. They're just pissed off middle-aged white guys.
Yeah, it's not the French Revolution.
Right. They
You
want
know,
their cake. They want it all. Right.
they have their cake.
So
They just don't want anybody
they have
else's.
their cake. Right. And
Yeah, I
and
mean
so Rick,
these fucking guys staying at the Willard, like the common people do.
Yeah.
I know, but I mean, it's such a strange thing, This in over the course of the next week or so on the Lincoln Project podcast, I'm going to do 3 straight episodes on the right wing extremism, and the episode that's going to drop tomorrow is with a guy named David Nywert, who's been covering
Sure, yeah,
right wing
yeah.
extremism in the Pacific Northwest for 30 years, and he said he's finally retiring because
Yeah.
that's where he spent 30 years, and who could blame him? But he said he would go to some of these meetings of the Aryan Nation and the Order back in the 80s. And he said,
Right.
these were guys that I could live next to. These are guys that, I could see at the coffee shop. And it
Sure.
always shocked him how normal some of the people that appeared at these things were.
Look, I mean, we were all talking this weekend about about the phenomenal podcast series called The Long Shadow by Garrett Graff,
And
about
Garrett
this
will be on
long
Monday. Yes.
great
Yeah.
about
Fantastic.
this long arc of white grievance politics infecting more and more and more and more and more of the Republican Party. And back then in the 80s, it was an edge. It was an outlier. It was a fraction. And then as talk radio and conservative television and then social media caused this explosion of this, I don't think the Democrats at this point still understand how powerfully altered the electorate is in certain areas. I still don't think they get it. I think there were a lot of people who were doing a victory lap last week, like, "Ha ha, Tucker's gone." This shit is wired deeply into the majority of the Republican Party base at a level that is increasingly comfortable with violence,
I
increasingly
mean, it's,
comfortable with attacks.
and they're to your point about Rick, whether or not it's thoughts and prayers. This guy in Allen, was he an immigrant? Or it's a mental health issue, right? Which they know it very well is. Don't get me wrong,
Sure,
but these are the same people who systematically cut mental health spending whenever they get the opportunity,
right.
right? So
Of
like
course, every time.
and then you see, Marjorie Taylor Greene Stewart was tweeting about this thing in Allen. They're making light of it, they're downplaying it. And then one of the people that responds to her, because she's talking about, the yet another invasion at the southern border, another caravan thing. And one of the people that responds to her, she go, "We have to stop it. The beasts are coming."
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that what Trump did, and we've talked about this a lot, he gave people permission to be their worst self. And
Right.
in doing so, he really mainstreamed a lot of these kooky theories. So that white replacement theory, all that stuff in the Northwest, the Aryan Nation, they were out there because it was largely a white area. You could buy land that was cheap. They were going to form their own countries,
Right.
be it Ruby Ridge, be it Waco, be it Oklahoma City.
Right.
That is all at the heart of it, a racist ideology. So now that gets mainstreamed on Fox, which Tucker talked about it over 500 times. So then what
Right.
happens? So this kid, 18-year-old kid walks into a Tops grocery store in an African-American neighborhood and shoots 13 people, of whom 11 are African-American, and leaves a 180-page, he calls it a manifesto. It's really just gibberish, but it's basically like notes from Tucker Carlson's show. And that's, I think that there is this misunderstanding so much that Fox created the Republican Party. It, Fox is following the Republican Party.
Just as
Fox
Trump
didn't want
revealed, just as Trump revealed it, right?
Trump revealed, Fox didn't want John McCain to win the nomination, but when he
No,
did, they went
fuck
along with
no.
it. They sure as hell didn't want Mitt Romney to go along with it. And they didn't want Donald Trump to win the nomination, actually. And now they're trying to elect DeSantis. At least they tried for a little while. But when you read those emails and the memos that went back and forth in the Dominion lawsuit, they were terrified that they were losing their audience to those who were more extreme, like Newsmax.
Right.
Right.
So they are chasing a market, not creating a market. But by doing this, they're repeating it, and they become an echo chamber, and it becomes this sort of doom loop. But now you're
Right.
discussing something white replacement theory as if it was like, well, a tax cut. Would this be good or not? It becomes a legitimate area of discussion, and that is just extraordinarily dangerous.
So, Rick, talk to us and talk to the audience a little bit about why, MAGA, why Trump, why Tucker, why are they? What advantage do they get from these guys going and shooting up a grocery store or massacring people at a synagogue in Pittsburgh?
They know that the purpose of terror is to terrify. They know that if they are going to be an authoritarian movement that's going to break the American experiment, that's going to break the American spirit, that people have to be afraid to vote, afraid to speak out, afraid to go out. They want people locked down in absolute fear that that they're going to be standing next to a black person when the crazy guy shows up, and they're going to become collateral damage. And again, that rule of no enemies to our right. You see these people, and they will go out and they will defend and say, no, the guy wasn't a Nazi. He wasn't a Nazi. When it turns out he's a Nazi, they'll say, well, he was a Nazi because, immigrants came and took jobs, and Antifa and Black Lives Matter and the trans people, and they're taking away your way of life. And they will always loop it back around. They will always try to shove the Overton window a little further, a little further, a little further, a little further. I heard somebody the other day in Florida, when it was brought up that my part of Florida, North Florida, the highest percentage in the country anywhere per capita of the Klan is a couple counties over from me. There are hundreds and hundreds of state law enforcement officers in various parts of Florida law enforcement, the FDLE, the Highway Patrol, local sheriff's departments, the prison system, who are active white supremacists, who are public about it online. And this legislator was like, well, no, I'm not going to go after those people because, they're loyal people. They're loyal voters. They will forgive anything. They will give up anything to not have someone to their right. They're afraid of being primaried or killed.
So,
And
Stuart, yeah, I mean, I actually started thinking about that the other day, or maybe it was last night after I'd interviewed David Nywert about his book. You could make an argument that the KKK in the last century, maybe early in the last century, up until the civil rights movement, was a template for how to do these things, right? They were
Listen, bro.
an embedded white nationalist movement that also held political power.
Yeah, and again, look, here's a quote when David Duke ran for governor, 1991, right? A guy who was a former grand wizard of the KKK, right? It
right.
wasn't like he had KKK sympathies. He was a goddamn grand wizard. So all these journalists went down there and covered it. And here's a quote from a
Right.
big piece that Newsweek did about David Duke. They said, for thousands of Louisiana whites angry with hard times and high taxes, his is the ultimate, quote, no bull campaign. I mean, that was
For the love
1991.
of God.
Right.
And so what was the difference? So just think about this. So what was the difference? In 1991, the Republican Party actively fought David Duke,
Let me tell
even
you, the
though it meant
administration sent a
that,
bunch of young assholes down there to do that work.
yes, you're
You know,
okay. All right, you did the Lord's work. So they were willing to do what so many are not willing to do now. President of the United States, Republican, was willing to help elect a Democrat governor of Louisiana
Yep.
to stop David. And that's the difference in the party now. There's always been these hate groups. There's always been the Father Coughlins. But what hasn't happened is it has not been adopted by a major party until now. And,
Right.
Yeah.
History shows that that's a very long
You know,
road to unwind.
And Rick, I just want
yeah.
to say this because, about the reaction to this stuff. A friend of ours texted, my sister, an uber progressive, is thinking of buying a gun. This is what the world has come to. They lined up our family and
Mhm.
shot them in Europe. We aren't making that mistake again.
And they
That's the
shouldn't
tree
make
of
that
life.
mistake
In the
again.
synagogue, there
I
was
mean,
a,
look, they shouldn't make that mistake again because,
yeah.
look, the Klan got dismantled in the 1960s after Cheney and Schwerner and Goodman were murdered down in Mississippi. And it finally reached the point where Lyndon Johnson said, I'm done with their bullshit. And he went down there, and the FBI, by their thousands, went down into the South and took the Klan apart bit by bit by bit. And outside groups who'd been harmed by the Klan sued the living shit out of them. They broke the back of a movement that is pure evil. Now, today, let me tell you something. In Florida, Ron DeSantis has spent vastly more time investigating drag shows than he has the fucking Ku Klux Klan. He spent
Or
vastly
black
more
people who
time,
voted.
right, attacking Walt Disney World than he has attacking the League of the South, which are a bunch of white supremacist terrorists in North Florida. And it strikes me every day that at the federal level, if Donald Trump is reelected, guess what, folks? Every one of those Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Patriot Front, Boogaloo Boys, white supremacists, every
Three
fucking
percenters,
one of them
oath
is
keepers.
getting
Yeah.
a pardon
Yep.
and a full commutation of their sentences. They're going to be
Hell, he'll
back on the
invite him to the
streets,
White House.
and they will be the shock troops of an army in this country like you've never seen before, to use a Trumpian phrase. But they will know there's no consequence to evil.
Yeah, talking about law enforcement and the Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, we now know that they were stopped by deputy sheriff
That's right.
and turned over to them.
That's right.
And in those days, there was very difficult to know what law enforcement you could trust. And that's why the FBI opened their office in Jackson, Mississippi for the first time. They had to bring in outsiders to try to make this happen. It's an extraordinarily dangerous moment when a guy who is the leading candidate for the nomination Republican Party is opening his rallies not with a pledge of allegiance to the United States, but a pledge of allegiance to the insurrectionist. And that's what he's doing. That's what he did in that Waco rally. They played
So
that
let's
anthem that they sing.
Yeah, right. So let's talk about this, guys, because we're pretty deep in the rabbit hole and it's easy to get there. And there's a lot going on that we should be worried about. But Rick, what's out there that we can do, right? I mean, I'm actually writing a piece about this right now.
Yeah.
Um, um, Trump told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. I feel like we have to say to our people, stand up and stand out, right?
Yeah. Look, you
You
cannot
can't.
live in. Yeah.
Yeah, go
You
ahead.
you you cannot live in fear. Okay. Our friend, I know who you're talking about, who sent us that message, and I remember reading that text message and thinking, "Good God," you
Mm,
know. But all authoritarian movements rely on your silence and your fear and the belief that somebody else will pick up the spear and somebody else will pick up the shield and somebody else will pick up the sword and fight back. And after 8 years of this, you can't rely on anybody else. Nobody else is coming to save us, folks. We've got to do this work, all of us. You've got to get out there and do the things they fear the most. Register to vote. Call out the people who are doing this shit. Call out the people that are the support structure of evil, because all this evil relies on people who pretend that they're not. All of it. It's like, why do we call out advertisers on Fox? Because they're paying the freight for the Tuckers and the Jesse Waters and the other racists in their midst. Why do I call out Steve Bannon all the time? Because he's the fucking mastermind. He's the center of the cancer of a lot of this. Mike Flynn, same story. You can't be afraid of them, even though they are trying to make you afraid. You got to stand up. And it's why we formed the Lincoln Project back in 2019. It's why we formed Resolute Square last year. Is every voice matters in this fight. Every moment of resistance to them, every little bit of friction, every bit of sand in their gears, every bit of a voice raised against them, it counts. And it is never easy. It is almost never fun. Sometimes you're afraid, and sometimes you end up feeling like it's pointless and you can't resist the tidal wave of their shit, but you can and you have to. And at the end of the day, I sleep a lot better every night than I used to. If your number's up, your number's up. But if you don't speak out and you don't fight back against these people, they will win. And every single minute that these fuckers think they're going to get away with it, they'll try to get away with it. And when they feel like they're going to get called out, and when they feel like they're going to be public all of a sudden, then that shit starts to change their behavior. Anyway.
Well, and Stuart, as Sun Tzu famously wrote too, that if the best way to beat your enemy is to believe they're already beaten, and that's what all of this is about, right? Is convincing us that it's not worth the trouble, that it's not worth,
Yeah, I mean,
that I mean, one of these guys, the guy that represents Allen, Texas, said the problem with that shopping mall was it was quote unquote a soft target, right? They want people scared, they want them in their houses, they want them to to close their eyes and cover their ears and say, I just want it all to go away. I want to be secure, Stuart. I want to be safe.
yeah, what about those guys that were killed in a bank? I mean,
Right.
a bank isn't a soft target. I mean,
Right.
it's such insanity. Um, you know, when, whenever these things, whenever democracy slide into autocracy, it's not because a majority wants that. It's because a minority makes it happen, and a majority can't imagine it happening. And that's if this happens in this country, and I think we have to allow for the possibility that it can. I mean, the problem with imagining the unimaginable is that it's unimaginable. But you have to make yourself see that this is possible. And a lot of things have happened in this country, step by step by step, that if you take them one by one, well, it's not that bad, it's not that bad. But cumulatively, and this is how it happens. So, I look, the 2022 election certainly could have been a lot worse, but afterwards, Marjorie Taylor Greene's the second most powerful person in the House of Representatives. That's incremental
Right.
gain. And today, Donald Trump is certainly competitive with Joe Biden. So
And
Yep.
and we'll
I
get to
think we
that
have,
next week in the context of
you
people
know,
flipping out about things that are don't panic before it's time,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we're
just
panic.
yeah, don't
But we'll dive on that next
yeah.
week. All right. Before we let everybody go, Rick, give us your final thoughts. What are you looking at?
I am watching right now the end of DeSantis coming sooner than I wanted or most people wanted. I was hoping we could drag this out longer and torture Trump a little longer. But, with two pieces out today, one about the indicators he's watching are going the wrong way, and one about his more of his Wall Street mainstream support abandoning him. I think we're gonna have to be fighting against Trump sooner than we wanted to or hope to. But that's what I'm keeping an eye on right now.
Stuart, how about you?
I'm going to be really interested to see how CNN handles this town hall tomorrow night.
Mm,
I think that there's been, by consensus among our journalist friends, that they failed at dealing with Trump in 2016.
sure.
The premise of that journalism, serious journalism, has always been that objectivity was the greatest good. That was the greatest goal. But as we said when we founded Resolute Square, how do you tell both sides of a lie? And
Right.
what autocracies do is they use the tools of democracy, like the free press, to dismantle that. So, what is going to happen tomorrow night? What is going to be different about tomorrow night than other times where we saw that Donald Trump just had free reign to spout this stuff? And it'll be interesting. I'm going to watch.
And do we think they'll ask him about the, E. Jean
Yeah,
Carroll?
I think that'll be the lead out question, and he'll lie
Yeah.
about it, and
I'll let it go.
she'll ask one brief follow up, and then he'll lie some more, and they'll move on because they want to put on a show.
Right, because I mean, CNN's always had sort of a weird position, Rich. Very good on straight. It used to be very good on straight news, obviously incredible in the international space, but
Yeah.
really doesn't know, especially with these new goons running it, has no idea where it belongs or to where,
John
where it's
Malone,
supposed to belong.
who owns it now, it wants them to get the Trump audience or part of it from Fox, and he sees an opportunity. That's why they're doing this. It is as venal and mercenary as it sounds.
Right. Well, listen, I mean, the one thing that I've been looking at is, how the country is responding to, a lot of years of trauma, guys. And I think that's one thing that I'm really
It's a really good
curious
point,
about
Rick.
is we've had 20 years of pretty nonstop black swan events. I'm not the first person to say this. I probably won't be
Right.
the end of it, but 2001, 2008 and 9, right? And then 2005 if you want to count Hurricane Katrina. And then we go through, we tip into a second decade of war, and not one but two countries, a lot of people coming home, right? Feeling left out, which is an
Broken.
abomination, but happens. And then all of the stuff with Trump happens, and then obviously COVID. A million people are dead. And just about everyone knows someone, or at least knows of someone, who was dramatically affected by that. And I think I interviewed a woman who's a psychologist at San Diego State University last week. The level of depression amongst young Americans born in 2001 spiked in 2012, and it hasn't come down, right? And so we are a country in crisis, not just politically, but I think in many other ways. And from my perspective, we've always had this sort of gung ho, rugged individualism amongst Americans. But as de Tocqueville said, it was always matched with a very strong community spirit. And I think if we're going to come out of this, guys, that community spirit, not only in the next 18 months, but in the next 18 years, is really going to have to make a big comeback.
Yep.
So. All
Yep.
right. Well, listen, everybody, make sure that you listen to Rick Wilson's The Enemies List podcast. Make sure you check out Stuart on Twitter and Resolute Square. Please, if you have not, check out the Lincoln Project podcast. I'll be writing here as well. Until next week, everybody, thanks so much and have a great night.
See you guys.
Thanks.